Hello, this is Inkfy, aka Lex, or Inkfy Creates, and today we're back by popular demand for a coloring tutorial. Now, I've gotten a lot of requests in the past regarding coloring tutorials, and how do you color, or how do you this, and how you do that, and I figured I'd just find a way to get right into it. Originally, I was stressing a lot over this because I don't do tutorials often. I don't really consider myself the best of teachers. However, because so many people asked and so many people were really willing to have me do this, I decided to just take a crack shot at it. So the main things to consider for this tutorial before getting in is that one is that while anyone can probably go through this tutorial and get the basics of regarding color, just keep in mind that this will be more useful to you if you already have a base understanding of drawing. So you at least started drawing, you're starting to get into the basic definitions, all of that. I wouldn't say this is for complete and total newbies, but I'm sure this can be helpful in some way, so I encourage everyone to try and take a look at this and see what you can do, or see if any techniques I mentioned here make any sense for you. That and this tutorial is also trying to focus more on the coloring aspects I use personally. So if I color a way that you don't hear, please don't feel offended or anything like that. This is just my personal way of doing it, and this is just my way of teaching it essentially. So with that out of the way, let's get started. I decided to just do a live showcase for this because I'm going to just be marking things up like I'm a teacher. This is technically a mini lesson, but let's see how this goes. So the first thing we're going to do is to go to the top. I just call this the coloring guy. I made multiple notes in regards to this. So the first thing we need to consider is color. Well, what is color? Color is hue. Well, some people debate that in the art community, depending on who you ask, but for the most part, these are used interchangeably. Color means hue. If you ever see someone to refer to something as a hue, it is more likely the color or the pigment if you're painting in this case. The next thing is saturation. Saturation equals intensity. That's basically how intense a color is on a scale. Now, intensity in particular is rather tricky because a lot of people define it under the idea of chroma. However, some people debate that chroma is entirely different from intensity. It really depends on who you ask. But again, if you ever see saturation or intensity in your art program, just know it's basically the same thing. It's just how intense a color is, how mind-numbingly bright it is, essentially. But that's not to be compared with value. Value is how light or dark a color is. This is simple enough. Essentially, depending on how light and dark a color is, it will showcase different values of intensity. I'll get to that in a minute, but for now, those are the main definitions you need to know. So it's basically hue is color. Oops, I'm gonna go back there. Get my pen. So basically, hue is color. Saturation is how intense a color is. And then value is how light a color is and how dark a color is. Alright, so the next thing we're going to go to is talk about 3 different color modules. These 3 different color modules are what we use now in today's world. These are, again, highly debated, as most things in the art world are. So as a result, you should take everything I say with a grain of salt. I'm just going to talk about what I think is the most important, which is going to be RYB. So let's start with that. RYB is the traditional color module that you see. This is the one you were taught in grade school. This is the one you see the most often. It's basically yellow, blue, and red. And that creates the color combinations of green, orange, violet, and then if you combine all these, you get a murky type of black. Next up we have is RGB, which is what most computers use. Now, if you're using a tablet or if you're using any digital art program right now, more than likely they're using RGB. Now, you may ask about the differences between RYB and RGB. In my opinion, I don't think it matters that much because unless you're printing, it's not going to really show too much of a difference if you ask me. So again, I wouldn't worry about this too much. Just know that most computers typically use RGB and that you're probably using RGB now if you're using any digital art program essentially. Next up is Cmyk. Cmyk is incredibly useful for printing. Again, we're not going to get into the whole debate with Cmyk. Some people heavily debate whether or not Cmyk is the true primaries in comparison to RYB, but in my opinion, it really doesn't matter in this case. Again, we're going to stick to traditional, which is R, Y, and B. Again, that is yellow, blue, and red, as well as the combinations that they create. So green, orange, violet, and altogether black. So the first thing we're going to discuss when it comes to colors is basically the different types of shades, tints, and tones they have, which I'm going to write down here and we'll discuss in a minute. So right now I'm just going to talk about the three different types of colors or three different types of modules for colors that you see here and what they can create. So if we stick to the primary colors, which is for RYB in particular, yellow, blue, and red, you may notice something interesting here, which I pointed out to the right, and that is these colors are not all the same type of color on the color scale. And what I mean is that some of these colors are warm and some of these colors are cool. Warmer colors tend to be associated with reds or yellows or oranges, while cooler colors tend to be associated with blues, violets, and deep greens. This traditional color, 3-color module that you see in classes and stuff, this one usually uses a mix of a warm blue, probably an ultramarine in this case, a very bright scarlet red, and then a very cool yellow. There is a difference between this type of yellow and an orange yellow, which I'm going to put here. Now, it doesn't seem like this is yellow, but for all intents and purposes, it is still on that warmer spectrum. As a result, when you see this color wheel, you might get a little bit confused because I see a lot of people pick from this and use this as a guide, and they're like, wait a minute, why is it not looking right? Why do my colors look muddy? And it's more than likely because the colors you're using are not really going towards each other. Typically, when it comes to coloring, you want to make sure that the warm colors are sticking with the warm ones and the cool ones are sticking with the cool ones. If you try combining a cool yellow with a warm blue, you can add a nice layer of contrast if they're separate, but if you try mixing it together, it's going to look really ugly. I'm going to just blend it here just to give you an example. Oops. I'm going to just zoom in here. There we go. So I'm just going to use the blend tool to blend it and give you an example. You see that ugly green it gives you when you blend it? You don't really like that. In comparison, if I were to use this more yellow-orange, I'll just tint this a little bit here. And then if I were to use the warmer blue, let's adjust that. Here we go. Now, if I were to blend this, you get a bit more of an intense green. It still looks grayish. However, you may notice that there is definitely a difference between this and the color it's creating in comparison to this, which is more of like a very murky green. Now, some people, they do want that, but if you see your colors are getting muddy, that might be something to keep in mind. You want to make sure that the colors you are choosing are more than less sticking with one another. However, if you think it's going to become samey and boring, I'm going to go over some ways in order to make sure that that doesn't necessarily happen with your illustrations. But regardless, the next thing we're going to go to for another color module is going to be secondary colors. I mentioned this beforehand. These are basically the color combinations you get from RYB. So basically, blue and red makes purple, or violet in this case. Red and yellow makes orange, and yellow and blue makes green. Now, something to keep in mind here is that these colors are also suffer from the same issue here. So you're seeing a warm yellow, for example. Sorry, a cool yellow. Excuse me, now I'm getting confused here. You're seeing a cool yellow over here. Let me just adjust that size. And then you're seeing a warm blue. And then we see a warm red. And what it's creating here is not matching at all, because this is clearly a warm orange. This is clearly, if we were to do yellow and blue together, is a cool green. And if we were to look at this violet here, this is a warm color and a warm color. So you think, okay, so that'll give you a warm violet. And to an extent, you're kind of right. It is giving you more of a warm violet. But I'd honestly prefer if they pushed it more here. I think this would be a much more suitable combination. But this is acceptable. This is the only one here that I think is actually more on the warm side. This entire bottom half section over here is what you want. You want to stick to the warmer colors, because when you start mixing these colors like this, it's not necessarily going to help in terms of overall consistency. You want to make sure that it's warm, 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 and then here you want to make sure that it's cool, cool, cool. So next up we have another important factor, and that is tertiary colors. It's pretty simple. It's in the name, tertiary, terch. Essentially, it's the colors that are combined to make the in-between ones. So essentially, yellow-orange, red-orange, or red-violet, blue-violet, yellow-green. It's rather simple. Think of it as just the in-between for the colors. So with that out of the way, after I do all that terminology at you, I'm going to throw some more. But don't worry, this will make a bit more sense, and I'll throw in some of my examples as well. So here we have shades. So shades, tints, and tones. These are three definitions that get thrown around a lot that don't make any sense when you throw them all together, but people kind of understand them as one thing and another, so I want to just clear some of these up. So shade, in the bare minimum, if we're going with the most basic definition possible, is adding black. That's it. You're just adding black to any sort of pigment or any sort of hue. Now, something to keep in mind with digital art is that we typically don't recommend adding black alone for digital art because pixels and how they function is a little bit different compared to paint on a canvas. I think with paint on a canvas, you can get away with adding black because there are certain qualities about it that make it appear more fresh, in my opinion. But when it comes to using black with pixels, I don't think it works as well. It doesn't mean you can't use it, but you just have to keep in mind that it probably won't function the exact same way as it would if you were doing it on a canvas. With that tidbit out of the way, I'm going to talk about tints. Tints is just the opposite of a shade. You're just adding white. Now, I don't see tints used as often compared to shading with black. Tints essentially is just adding a bit of white to a hue. So let's say you have this light purple over here. I just added a bit of white to it. You got that. And then tone is the relative light and darkness of colors. So essentially here, it's a difference between a midnight blue and a baby blue, which I show here. So here's the midnight, and then here's the baby blue. And then the next thing we're going to discuss is three different types of color relationships, or four in this case, if you want to count this. So the first one is monochromatic. Monochromatics are basically one hue with a variety of shades, tints, and tones, the three things we just mentioned. Now, a lot of people seem to equate monochromatic with grayscale. Now, I need to say this right now that grayscale is not the only type of way to create a monochromatic scheme. You can use it with certain colors like reds, blues, yellows. It's just one of the easiest ways to show because you can see all the individual tints, tones, and shades with this bar graph I have here. However, you can do it for other colors. It's just a little bit more difficult because certain colors saturate at different levels of intensity, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. Next is analogous colors. These are essentially the colors that are next to each other and are tertiary. So just combine what we learned about tertiary colors here with the colors we see on a color wheel. So think yellow, yellow-orange, orange, blue, blue-violet, violet. Next is complementary colors. Complementary colors are simple. If you have a color wheel, you just draw a line from the color that's opposite. So red is green, orange is blue, and then violet is yellow. And again, keep in mind, this is for an RYB color wheel. I would not say this is exactly the same for RGB. 4 is tetradic. So tetradic color relationships are basically complementary colors paired together. So get two pairs of complementary colors you like and just pair them together. So I have this darker orange and darker blue-green, and I have this darker light red and this lighter green. This is something I like here. Usually you can make some really nice color palettes here, and I do recommend this palette. It's very popular with some sort of designs. Very easy on the eyes. Next is Triadic. Triadic is rather simple. If you can draw a triangle in the color wheel between three colors, you create a triadic color scheme. Congratulations. The benefits of drawing the triangle color scheme, though, that I'll highlight here, is that you are able to get some interesting combinations that you might not have considered. Like this three color schemes doesn't seem like something you typically consider with colors. However, it actually makes for a really nice color palette once you get down to it. When you put it together, you can definitely have a bunch of opportunities to use these in some sort of interesting way. So I do recommend maybe on a color wheel, you should just blindfold yourself and just draw a triangle and see what colors you get. Sometimes you get something really interesting. And then lastly, this is not a color relationship, but I'm going to talk about something that a lot of people discuss with colors, and that is pastels. Now, the reason why I'm putting pastels in their own category is that a lot of people seem to just think pastels is just light color, or that pastels is just high intensity, lighted it up, and that's good. That's not what pastels are. I've seen a lot of people assume my work is pastels too, and I don't even use pastels. I don't really like using them as much. Pastel colors, which I need to define here, is high value, low intensity. I even wrote it here. High value, low intensity. The base color itself is not necessarily changing. You're just changing the intensity of the color and the value of the color. And a lot of people perceive this to mean that you're just lightening the color, but that's not necessarily it. It's more of the high value of the color being at a lower intensity. So if you look at these colors here, and I use them as an example, if I go over to our color wheel, or color square in this case, I'll use a triangle to make it a bit more understandable. If you see here, the lighter colors are up here, the darker colors are down here. You see how this color is more light. However, if you were to check out the intensity is rather low. This is not a very intense color. The intensity would be at the end of this spectrum. And this is how dark the color would be here. But it's far from being super intense. Again, low intensity, but the value is near white. It's extremely high. Again, we'll use this color. Very low intensity. If you see the point where it is from the most intense part of the color, or the highest chroma here, this is very close to white. This is not close to here at all. A common mistake I see people do is that they just take this color, I'll use this for example, put it here, I'll select this color, lighten it up, and call it a day. But that's not really a true pastel in my opinion. I think that's more of a hack people use to get a color close to pastel. Again, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but I've just been so trained to see this that whenever I see people use it, I'm just like, oh yeah, I saw what they did there. And to be fair, I do have my own sets of cheats as well, so I can't really blame people for that. But that's just something to keep in mind. This would be what I would consider a true example of pastels. These lighter color palettes that are low intensity, but a high value. So very light and low in intensity. So what does all of this mean in general? Again, I'm going to go back to my earlier statement. Again, different colors saturate at different levels of intensity. Now that we've gone over most of the basic terms that I went through in college, we're just going to say that again. Different colors saturate at different levels of intensity. So what does that mean? That means that depending on the hue, aka the color, it's going to be saturated at a different level of intensity. As a result, the value you get from a very intense red is not going to be the same value you get from a very intense yellow. So let me explain what I mean using my own artwork. Here I'm going to use my amulet die work. I did this recently. And a lot of people ask me about the coloring in regards to here. And something to keep in mind is that when you're using colors like this, you have to understand how these color relationships work first and foremost. And not only that, you have to understand at which levels do certain colors intensify at. So let's look down here. Let's look at the colors of her skirt. Amulet Daya essentially has a skirt where the underneath frills are essentially yellow. Something to keep in mind with that is that yellow saturates at a different intensity compared to a blue, for example. If I were to just go with a dark yellow, let's just go down the scale here. I'll use this as an example. If I were to just use this, and then let's say I make this lighter. Let's go up here. I'm making some jumps, but still. If I were to make this super light from the original yellow color, this is probably the lightest I could go. I'm skipping a few steps in between, but I just want to show the point. But this is not necessarily the best looking color in comparison to the original. The original has a very bright orangey, almost coolish yellow. However, when I try making that color darker, that is not the same level of intensity compared to this yellow that is more akin to Amulet Daya's original color scheme. And not only that, if you were to put this in grayscale, let's reduce the saturation, that does not look at all the same in terms of value. This is clearly darker compared to the darker color here. So what the heck is going on? Essentially, I learned this from Marco Buschi's videos, but essentially certain colors tend to saturate at different levels of intensity, meaning that the value is also affected by it. So again, referring back to the terms we just went through, value is light and darkness. So depending on how intense a color is, how light and dark it is also going to change. So as a result, using just a dark yellow to shade the underneath of the skirt would not always be the most appealing option, because some dark yellows are just not very appealing depending on how they're used. And if it doesn't fit the original color scheme that well, is there really a point to using it? So one of the things I like to do is I'm taking my eyedropper tool with the eye, is that I like to create a color boomerang using a transition between a color that does saturate at a darker level of value, excuse me. So here I'm going to start with this violet I have. This is a darker violet, and I'm going to slowly move down to the yellow. Now I want to go and do this again, and I want you to pay attention to the top right corner of where the triangle is. You see that shift in color? That's what we call the color boomerang, that slow moving shift. And obviously, for my personal preference, I do skip a bunch of steps here. However, it still creates that illusion of depth, which is what you're looking for. Again, let's go to another part of her body. Let's go to her chest, I guess. So if we see that level of intensity, we see that her face is a bit warmer compared to the underneath of her face, her neck area. If we use that transition again, we see that color shift. We go back up, we see that color shift happening. And if we were to go back down to where the lightest part is, you see the color shift going crazy here, but essentially that's what you're looking for. This ring I put around her chest area isn't just to exemplify that part or to exemplify the shirt and exaggerate that. It's to basically show that transition between the blue and the yellow, because this is a very bright white. However, there is still yellow present here, and you want to basically exaggerate that yellow by giving that illusion of depth using the terminator. And what I just said may not make any sense, but I'm just going to point out a terminator is basically just a transition between your shading and the light source. That's basically it. Nothing too fancy here. I'll use another example here. This is again a very pale light yellow. When we shift down and use the color boomerang technique, look at that, it starts to become darker. And this is the benefits of understanding why colors intensify with different levels of values. Because if we just made this a dark yellow, it would not nearly be as dark enough to be considered noticeable for a piece like this. You really want to make a piece where it's at nighttime like this, which I wanted to stand out. And you can't really make it stand out if you don't understand what colors transition into darker values. And this is a trick I use. It's definitely not 100% accurate, but this is something you may want to consider with your own work as well. And something I need to clarify here, because some people may ask, this is not the same as putting a gradient on your work. Like, don't just put a blue gradient on your work and claim that it's depth. That's not how it works. Most people see that. What you need to understand is how these colors develop and connect with one another. So if you look here, these are more akin to an orange compared to Amulet Daya's cooler yellow scheme, but it still gives the illusion of being her original outfit, because there's no rule saying you can't shift from warm to cool colors in the same illustration. Because here, this is definitely more of the warmer color that's found in her original reference, but as it shifts further away from the light, I tend to go much cooler. So I start to go more to an orange or a cooler orange. This is something you may want to consider with your own work as well. Just understanding how those transitions between the light source and the colors you're using work. So going back to this, I just want to also discuss how this relates to how I color. And this is the main part of the video as well. So something to keep in mind is that different colors, again, saturate at different levels of intensity. As a result, I tend to exaggerate that for my own personal use. This is technically the correct way of doing it. I think it's a really crappy module, but again, this is just a general guide. You've probably seen this on the internet plenty of times. Different artists do it different ways. This is just my loose way of doing it. So essentially, the first things we're going to point out is what makes up shading. You have your general highlight, so the lightest part of the body. Let's assume this is a ball of skin. Then there's the light source. This is the general light source that you're using. Then you have the halftone or the midtone that you use here. And this is basically the base color you'll be using for your work. Something that a lot of people don't seem to understand is that your light source is not just the base color, it's also the midtone that you're creating. And if you don't focus on making a base color to work from, you can make things either too light or too dark. So the next thing to consider is also going to be the core shadow. This is going to be this part over here. And then next is going to be the reflective light. This small soft light over here. Then this is the cast shadow, so this entire area. And this is just a basic loose model of what it is. Again, you could go more into it, but this is just what I've picked up and what I've learned here. So for me, I basically make everything rather intense here. I tend to rather much exaggerate because my work is a bit more on the cartoony side, and that's just something I'm looking for. So here, I see that there is not a pure white for highlights that I use. I don't typically like using pure white at all, but essentially a lot of tutorials kind of focus on that, but that's not one thing I really liked. I never liked using pure white because I don't feel like it's a little bit unnatural. So what I use is that I use a soft gradient of the original base color, and then I tint it until I get a color that's near white, and I use that. Because this is actually a very, very pale pink. It's not officially white. You see here on the triangle, it's not officially at the top of the triangle. It's not white. Next is the light source. The light source tends to be rather, I would say it's rather more akin to a mid-tone for me. Again, I focus on the base tone being used to build upon my light source. So I'll sometimes have a base tone that is my light source and then shade it. Depends on what you want to do, honestly. This would be considered more the half tone, or if you want to say the mid-tone, go ahead. I don't think it's a proper mid-tone. I think I skip on that entirely sometimes. And then next is the cool shadow. And then we have that ambient light that we have over here. I'm just gonna, mark that in red. And then next you have your core shadow. Now something to keep in mind with the core shadow that I create is that I make sure that I have imaginary terminators. And I've thrown that term around. What does a terminator mean? It's just a transition between the core shadow and the light source, essentially. It's an in-between, essentially. Terminator, where something ends. Now, the way how I define it is technically not correct, but again, this is just what I use for stuff like this. And here I do try to add a bit of a gradient to the core shadow. This is because I repeat the same process with the shadow. I like having some of that reflective light in the shadow leading to the darkest part. That way it's not just a dark shadow completely. and it gives a bit more depth to the work itself. Now again, this is my way. This is not entirely accurate whatsoever. And again, take everything I say with a grain of salt. But if you do want to try doing it this way, you can consider it. The Terminator I do create is from this color. I just found it's a nice color to use. You can use this as well. I do it at a low opacity, typically between 40 or 30%. It really gives you a nice color. So now that we've got that out of the way, something else I want to mention is that you may be wondering now, what does this all mean then? What do we use all of this for? How are we going to use it in an effective way? Well, I have been experimenting because you can technically use any colors with this type of method that I'm using, as long as the method is two things: consistent and well-intentioned. Now, if you just go and throw colors willy-nilly when it comes to stuff like this, most people are going to be able to tell when you're just throwing colors at a screen and seeing what's fit. However, if you do try to make these more well-intentioned and more consistent with the mood you're going for, then this will appeal to be much more professional, much more intentional. So we're going to use an example, and that's going to be from my card captor Sakura work that I did recently. So this is the work that I have here. Now with this, I kind of went out of my comfort zone, started using colors that I typically don't use often. Again, I don't really use tinted colors or pastels that often. So going through here, you may notice a couple of things, in that the coloring is rather unnatural. For example, Sakura's hair is brown. However, the colors I'm using is clearly not a pure brown. It's multiple browns, almost dark oranges that I'm using. I even combine it with some light oranges here that almost go to a more intense hue over here. However, something to consider still is that if we use our relationships that we know about with the color wheel, that I still found a way to make it somewhat consistent. So for example, I do end up using lighter oranges to accommodate the brown. However, I also have lighter blues that go with that as well. And I have that transition between the lighter blues and the orange by using more of this violet color to create that imaginary shift. Now again, this is not 100% accurate, but when experimenting like this, you are allowed to go a bit more freeform and figure out what works best here. Some colors can work together very well if you know what you're doing. Usually I like to look up color palettes from other artists and see what they do as well. In this case, I decided to test out a couple of rainbow techniques I saw other artists use and try them by myself. So here I'm going to use this dress as an example. People are wondering how I got this effect. Well, I'm not truly creating all these colors in the dress itself. What I'm doing is essentially using more intense colors with more lighter tones here. So you have this very light baby blue that I'm using with this more light violet, which is also being complemented by this violet over here, which is a bit on the lighter side. This is the lightest part. And then the darkest color is actually this blue. Here, this creates an effect with the shape that I'm using. I typically use an H shape because I think you can get a lot out of it. With H's, you can bend them and you can also wrap them around cylinders. And guess what the human body is? Basically a bunch of meaty cylinders that you put together that creates a form. So for example, if I'm using Sakura's arm, with the H symbols that I use, I can essentially wrap my shading around the arm and still create a nice effect, because you could do a lot with an H shape compared to an S or a C shape. In my opinion, if you were to use an S or a C shape, you would have to go through a lot of hoops in order to get it to work. And I think that's where a lot of people struggle, because they try fitting a C on a curve. But visualizing a C on a curve, I think, is much harder compared to visualizing an H, because you have that imaginary boundary created between this line here with the H compared to a C. A C, you essentially have to learn how to put on a cylinder. So you'd have to wrap it around, and sometimes this works well. Most people learn like this. I learn like this as well, but it's not always the most effective, especially when you're trying to shade. The same goes for an S as well. That's a little bit harder, but some people do find a way to wrap an S around a cylinder as well. They can imagine it forms, so they can imagine an S going all the way around, wrapping around the form, creating the shade that they want. However, something to consider as well is how you put these together. There's no rule saying you can't put them all together at one go. So as a result, certain parts of the body may use certain different types of techniques or certain types of shapes. So for example, I use H shapes the most commonly for, let me get this here. I use H shapes the most commonly for hair. So this shape you see, which I'm going to copy, Control C, Control V, and then I'm going to bring it out just to compare. So if you were to trace this, you would notice that I'm creating that imaginary H shape that's giving the work volume essentially. I'm creating that 3D space using an H. You can kind of see it over here. And when you put it here, again, you're getting the H shape that I commonly use with hair. H for hair. That makes more sense, right? But when it comes to stuff like skin, you typically don't want to use H shapes because it's going to look rather awkward. It'd be rather awkward if I started painting over this and I started going with the H shape. And then let's say I use the airbrush to soften the edges. It looks rather weird, and sometimes you don't really want that when it comes to something like this. So instead, when it comes to stuff like cylinders, I use C shapes. C for cylinder. So if you were to have a cylinder right now, excuse the poorly drawn cylinder, you'd basically take the shading and wrap it around. This is how I get parts like this. Essentially, I'm wrapping around the cylinder. Or you can look over here. I'm wrapping around the creases of the dress at these points. These are what's creating the shapes that make the artwork, in my opinion, a bit more appealing to my eyes. So the next thing we're going to go over is the less commonly used S shape. Now S shapes can be used for a variety of things. You can also morph them a bit to be more of a squiggle. For the wings, for example, that's what I use, the S shape. Typically when I use S shapes, I try to do this upside down because it just makes more sense to do it that way. When you look here and you see the type of shading I'm using to create the wings, you notice that they follow kind of a distinct pattern. This is more the scribbles I'm talking about. You're creating the S shape by using these types of scribbles to create depth. Now granted, these are not as well defined and they're not very much dark in terms of value, but they still create a nice light effect, which is what I wanted for this piece. And again, color does play a part in this as well. If you use very dark S shapes, you're going to get intense wrinkles in your work, and that's something you may want or something you may not want. It really depends on what you want to do. So again, going back on this, you can combine these two types of shapes in order to create compositions that you find appealing or color choices that you want to use to shade. So S, C, and H. I personally use H, so I for Inkfy, but most artists I've seen use C since it's easy to wrap around the cylinder and understand, and some of them use S. So now the last thing I do want to go over is going to be my How to Color series. I made this years ago, but I figured I'd just do a recap since you just went over these again. So again, warm colors are usually reds, oranges, and yellows. They're usually on the lighter side. They tend to be rather intense, however, and a lot of people are drawn to them. Blue colors are considered passive. They tend to be very calming. So that includes blues, violets, or greens. Tetradic colors, again, are just double complementary colors. Monochromatic is just a palette comprised of variations of a single hue. So it could be basically any color that has a bunch of tints, shades, or tones of differentiations. And next is triadic. Triadic, I have trouble pronouncing this always, triadic. But basically, if you can form a triangle, you can create a color scheme. And for Clip Studio Paint, usually what I do is I tend to scan images in and then I color them using the color method. We're using Colorize. Now, I'm not going to get into all that in this video. I already went into it for another tutorial you can find on my Ko-Fi. But regardless, this is much of all I have to say on color. That's basically the start of how I do everything and how I decide to choose my colors. I typically like following the color wheel and then using complementary colors to create that depth, as usually the opposing complementary color will usually add a nice layer of value to the colors that you're working with. So if you start with a light complementary value like orange and then you use something like purple, it's going to create a really nice effect. So overall, that's all I have to say on color. I don't think I have much else to add on to this. I will make another video in the future talking about my digital art process for 2022 onwards, but this is the most I have to say on color. Other than that, I'm pretty much good to go in that regards. I hope this was helpful for you. Feel free to leave your comments in the comment section. I'd love to see what you guys think. Otherwise, that's pretty much it. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.